Thank you, everyone, for coming along. My name's Adrian Marshall. If you haven't met me before, I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network, and we are part of the Victorian National Parks Association these days. Just recently, I spoke to the Standing Advisory Committee panel about Melton East PSP in fighting for the seasonal herbaceous wetlands there. And part of the many developers had lined up to say that all the good stuff should go. And a lot of the argument focused around artefact scatters, First Nations artefact scatters, and how there should be a certain distance from them, perhaps as a buffer and that sort of thing, which completely missed the idea that they were just the tangible moments, I suppose, the things that we or archaeologists happened to see when they looked, rather than the vast intangible network of ecology and country and so on. And that's just by way of introduction to say that I should acknowledge the elders of the Wurundjeri, and past and present, who may be with us today, and all the people of the Kulin Nation, really, and more broadly all the First Nations people whose care for country has really left us this magnificent legacy that we have been doing our best to trash, but there are many among us who have been working to make it better too. So, yes. We are very lucky tonight to have Garry Peterson with us. Garry is let me get this correct, I've got to do it right, the General Manager of Threatened Species at Zoos Victoria, and he's the chair of the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon National Recovery Team, which is leading efforts to protect our friend Earless, which you can see in front of us. Garry has chaired several recovery teams, authored recovery plans, and otherwise been involved in all sorts of high-profile threatened species recovery programs. The orange-bellied parrot, eastern barred bandicoot, southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo, brush-tailed rock wallabies, southern right whale, and a host of flora species. He's also a very experienced herpetologist who has focused on grassland reptile ecology and conservation. So please, you probably feel free to interrupt Garry as he gives his talk, but throw your questions in the chat if you would prefer, and we'll try to get to them all. And yeah, without further ado, yes, over to you, Garry. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Yes, look, as Adrian introduced me, Garry Peterson, General Manager of Threatened Species at Zoos Victoria and Chair of the recovery team. Sorry, I had a recovery team meeting today, so which was pretty draining. So, just a little bit more background around me. I've been at Zoos Victoria for 3 years. Prior to that, I was 20 years at DECA and its predecessors in southwestern Victoria. So, despite not working for DECA anymore, I am still a public servant, with Zoos Victoria being a government entity. So I will acknowledge up front that I do need to be careful what I say and certain topics that I can and can't talk about. So I will give, I suppose, advance warnings that please don't take any offence if I can't answer a question on some specific topics. So tonight, it's a privilege to speak to you all about the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon, which I'll refer to as a VGED through most of the presentation, to talk to you about its recovery and also the second chance we have with this species. So a species that many people thought was lost. So I would first like to begin to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all on tonight. I'm on Peak Wurrung country of the Maar Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, whose land is home to the only known remaining wild population of the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon, and acknowledge all the mobs of the Kulin Nation who cared for the country on which the VGED historically occurred. I'd like to recognise their ongoing spiritual and cultural connections to the land, skies and waters, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and to any other Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be listening in tonight. Also, while I'm presenting tonight, the work that I am presenting is really underpinned by a team effort, and I really want to acknowledge the many people who have and continue to contribute to the response following the rediscovery of this species. So, there's a lot of people there, but I'd really like to acknowledge their work, their knowledge, and also in particular their photographs that are throughout this presentation tonight. So as I said, acknowledge their significant contribution to the presentation. For those who aren't aware, Zoos Victoria is a zoo-based conservation organisation. We have 4 properties: Melbourne Zoo, Werribee Open Range Zoo, Hillsville Sanctuary and Kyabram Fauna Park. In 2009, following the tragic extinction of the Christmas Island pipistrelle, Zoos Victoria made an ambitious commitment to fight extinction and made a pledge that no Victorian terrestrial vertebrate would go extinct on our watch. When I started at Zoos Victoria in 2022, of our 27 fighting extinction species, so that ranges from helmeted honeyeater to Lord Howe Island stick insect to Grassland Earless Dragon, so of those 27 species, and our commitment or our pledge that no Victorian vertebrate will go extinct on our watch, I said to our CEO, Jenny Gray, that our one Achilles heel was the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon. So the VGED is a small cryptic gamid lizard, so it grows up to no longer than 15 centimetres in total length. As the name suggests, it's endemic to Victoria. Knowledge on its ecology was, until recently, limited, but when we inferred it from its closely related species, the Canberra and Monara Grassland Earless Dragons, it was assumed that most individuals probably live for 1 to 2 years in the wild. They probably only breed once to twice. They're probably hilothermic basking reptiles. They'll be oviparous, so egg-laying lizards. So very similar to those 2 species was, what we based our limited knowledge on. The early records of the lizard described it as a small lizard, often found under loose basalt rocks. And the lizard actually, when disturbed, would retreat to small spider holes. So these are observations from, say, 1894. The records also had it associated with grasslands and actually saline areas around Melbourne to Melbourne's north. So areas like the Maribyrnong River. It was also described during the 19th and early 20th century as being not uncommon. So it was a species that, was quite abundant. Early records were from places we're all going to be familiar with. So places such as Port Melbourne, Coode Island, Paran, Essendon, Moonee Ponds. So they were the early records, with later records around Werribee, Rockbank, Sunshine and Little River. So when you look at those records, you can see that the species has largely been associated with the Keilor-Werribee Plains. And as you can see from the maps that are up there, including the one on the bottom right, those historical records are predominantly sitting under Australia's largest city. And what little habitat does remain is it within the pathway of the city's expansion westwards towards Geelong. So, as I said before, during the 1800s, the species was considered relatively common. By the mid-20th century, it was considered rare. Then, in the late 60s, the last confirmed records occurred. In the 3 decades that followed that, particularly from the 1990s to the late 2010s, several extensive targeted surveys occurred, often led by or advised by Peter Robertson. So for those who don't know Peter, Peter's Victoria's eminent reptile expert. He wrote the book on Victorian reptiles and is also a mentor to many herpetologists in Victoria. Peter, I think, first surveyed for the Earless Dragon in 1977, but I suppose his most significant efforts occurred during the 1990s, often with Alan Webster, who used to work for Deaker and its predecessors, and I'm sure many people are aware of Alan and his work he did over his career on grasslands. As I alluded to before we started, I undertook extensive surveys between Geelong and Werribee, mainly focused around Lara and Little River between 2008 and 2013, with a small team from Deaker or its predecessor, which included Donna McMaster and Trevor Proud. And then the Arthur Ryll Institute through Nick Clement also undertook surveys through the middle 2010s. And then Zoos Victoria ramped up its efforts from about 2014 for about 3 years, again, west of Melbourne and as far west on the volcanic plains to Dundonald. I'd also guess that during those 30 years, there's probably been hundreds of direct or indirect surveys that were undertaken, particularly associated with environmental impact assessments for urban and industrial expansion of Melbourne's west. And a lot of these, in particular the indirect surveys, would have been for the striped legless lizard, Delma impar. So despite these extensive targeted indirect surveys in grasslands over the past 30 years, the species remained undetected and presumed by many to be lost. Because of its perilous situation, it was a species identified in 2021 by academics associated with the National Environmental Scientific Program as Australia's most imperilled reptile. So that's the reptile most likely to go extinct if it wasn't already so. So, look, I really don't need to speak to the audience here around the primary causes of decline. It's like grasslands collectively. A lot of it has been agricultural intensification and urban expansion. We're all familiar with natural temperate grasslands, effectively Australia's most threatened and rapidly declining ecosystem, with less than 1% remaining, mostly in small remnant patches, susceptible to degradation and loss via weed invasion, inappropriate management and development. Specifically, the threats to the lizard as well, in addition to those direct threats to its habitat, would have been the cessation of biomass management, so the removal of grazing and historically fire, the removal of rocks, weed invasion, in particular weeds that come in and really change the structure of the habitat, biocides, and in particular pesticides that would have led to significant declines in invertebrates, as well as predation by rodents, cats and foxes. So as a collective, we've got a lizard that hadn't been seen for 50 years and things certainly weren't looking good for it. Enter Pat Manaka and Emmy Arnold on the 20th of January 2023. So Emmy and Pat are two young ecologists undertaking surveys for striped legless lizard as part of an environmental assessment for a proposed housing development on Melbourne's outskirts. Through their surveys, they captured a dragon which they hadn't seen before and weren't familiar with. Calls were made, photos were sent, and by that afternoon, I'd been informed that maybe, just maybe, the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon had been rediscovered. And I do say maybe because there were certainly some doubts. Was it a hoax? Was someone taking the piss? Had someone released Canberra or Monaro animals in Victoria? And we wouldn't and couldn't believe it until we had animals in the hand. And even then, there was still a small amount of doubt. I do need to acknowledge that the rediscovery nearly didn't happen. So, and this isn't to highlight any failings from the consultants, but it's just to acknowledge that the species is extremely cryptic and it certainly can be missed in surveys. So, look, I've estimated over a couple of years in which surveys happened at that property, there's about 14 tile grids set out for striped legless lizard surveys of a total of about 50 tiles per grid. The sites were surveyed, certainly the ones where the lizard was rediscovered. The surveys had happened 8 times, which is what the prescriptions for striped legless lizard says you need to do, generally between September and December. At this site, though, I think it was because of heavy rainfall that they decided to push out one more survey into January, and it was on that final survey that the dragon was discovered. So it just indicates how close we came to actually not having that rediscovery occur. Within 48 hours of the rediscovery, we had people on site establishing and having critical conversations with the landholders and starting surveys to confirm the rediscovery and bring animals into a conservation breeding program to ensure we didn't miss this second chance of conserving a lost species. Then, 3 weeks after the rediscovery, this happened.
Sitting on top of the. Right. Look at the colour. Oh, Dion. Look at him shaking.
Oh, mate, that is brilliant.
Shake it. That's the top.
No, it's yeah.
So that was Dion Gilbert from Zoos Victoria, Peter Robertson, and also myself, who went out there, as I said, 3 weeks after the rediscovery, and we had people out there prior to that. And on that day, we got the first confirmed record of an additional juvenile, as well as an adult that we found in a spider hole. And ironically, that adult actually ended up being the original animal that was captured, photographed, and released by Emmy and Pat. Within weeks of the rediscovery, a recovery team of partners had been formed, including Zoos Victoria, Museums Victoria, state and federal environment agencies, Peter Robinson's company Wildlife Profiles, and Wadawurrung Traditional Owner Corporation. 3 weeks after the rediscovery, as I've said, the first 3 dragons came into the conservation breeding program as founders. We made the decision to immediately start bringing in founders into the program, which was guided by the recovery or the rediscovery response protocol, which was outlined in the National Recovery Plan. And this protocol effectively gave us the authorising environment to start bringing in those founders. We did do it with, not actually knowing the size of the wild population and not knowing the implications of potential impact to the wild population. But we all agreed that the benefits of trying to bring in these founders and establish the conservation breeding program as soon as possible, the benefit of that outweighed the risks. Soon after bringing those individuals in, we had genetic analysis undertaken against the 1908 museum specimen to close out any doubt that these weren't Victorian Grassland Earless Dragons, and those genetic results came back as a match. So what is it with this site? Why has the lizard persisted there? The site isn't that different when we first went out there to many other sites that Peter and myself and others had surveyed over the years. It's certainly not a pristine grassland. The habitat at the time of the rediscovery was, it's a rocky, treeless grassland dominated by cool season growing C3 native tussock grasses, a couple of grass species and several species of wallaby grass. Between the tussock, there was, ample, numerous annual exotic pasture weeds growing. There was very few native forbs, and there was perennial weeds and a relative abundance of them, predominantly serrated tussock. But what stood out in those early days and subsequent to that is the diversity and the high abundance of invertebrates at the site, and the dragon's very strong and possibly symbiotic relationship it has with wolf spiders. But the other key factor around this, and the key factor of why the dragon was still there, was the landholders. So we had 60 or 70 years of continuous management of that site by the patriarch of that family. He valued the native pastures as feed for his sheep. He managed it accordingly by rotating the flock on and off as required based on, the condition of the native pasture. And he undertook little improvement or pasture improvement of that site. So without that biomass management, we wouldn't be sitting here talking today, and the dragon would not have persisted at that site. And I really do need to take this opportunity to acknowledge his children and their partners who have been extremely accommodating to us and continue to implement the management at that site despite the intrusion this has had on their lives and the impact the rediscovery has had on their plans and their aspirations for that property. So yes, there was lots of celebration when we could finally announce it, and lots of media talking about the positives and, you know, rediscovery of a lost species, etc. And I did emphasise that I can't talk about government policy, etc., and things like the MSA and housing crisis, but I will acknowledge that there was also plenty of negative media and scaremongering around it. And I just wanted to emphasise the quote in this article, because I think it'll be pretty obvious to anyone who reads it and the people sitting in this room, the irony of that comment in regard to a balanced approach. So a second chance. So despite everything pointing towards the species being lost, when the rediscovery did occur, Zoos Victoria were ready. The planets really were aligned. Look, part of this was because of the foresight of Zoos Victoria and two people in particular, Alex Mitchell and Rory Keenan. They outlined in 2019 that if the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon was ever rediscovered, recovery would be underpinned by a conservation breeding program. So to understand what would be required to such a program, they started work on an analogue species to master the husbandry and the breeding of the closely related Canberra Grassland Earless Dragon. This was done to allow us to apply those learnings to the Victorian species should it ever be rediscovered. So when I say we had the right people in the right place at the right time, it was Rory and Alex and their foresight. We also had Dion Gilbert, who's our threatened species biologist. Dion has extensive experience at leading our frog conservation programs, and he'd also started involvement with the on-ground conservation program for the Canberra species. We had Nick Kleeman, who had led several recovery programs on Victorian herps and reptiles in particular. He was on secondment to Zoos Victoria from the Arthur Riley Institute. We had Peter Robertson with his experience looking for the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon, but also his experience working on the conservation of the Canberra species. Peter just entered semi-retirement at his place north of Melbourne. And I'd just come over to Zoos Victoria, as I said before, you know, from DECA, with my extensive experience looking for the dragon, but also around reptile ecology more broadly. And we also had a pool of other experts to draw on. We had people like Marissa Parrott from Zoos Victoria, and I'll talk about the work she did in a minute around population viability analysis. We had the Zoos Victoria detection dog team. We had people like Chris Hartnett at the zoo, who has extensive experience of working on grasslands and working with landholders around managing grasslands for Plains Wanderer. Jessie Sinclair, our invertebrate conservation officer, and we could draw on her from her invertebrate expertise. And we had people like Sally Edwards, Vanessa Craigie, Steve Sinclair, and their vegetation and flora expertise we could draw on. And also Jane Melville and Joe Sumner from the museum and their genetics expertise. Look, as I said, an effective conservation breeding program was going to be critical to underpinning the recovery of the Victorian Grassland Earless Dragon. So because of that, we undertook a workshop in autumn 2023, so very, very soon after the rediscovery, to determine what sort of numbers we would require in a captive or an in situ perspective or program to effectively guarantee insurance from extinction, to maintain genetic diversity and produce animals for reintroduction into the wild to establish additional populations. So through that workshop, we determined that a conservation breeding program of about 500 individual lizards or more was required to provide insurance against extinction, to maintain greater than 95% genetic diversity over a 20-year timeframe, and to provide more than 100 animals annually for releases in the wild to establish additional populations. In addition to that planning, from a strategic conservation planning perspective, while we had a recovery plan or a draft recovery plan, it was written for 4 species. So the Victorian, the Canberra, the Monara, and the Bathurst species. So it certainly didn't have the nuance that was required for a detailed recovery program. And from a Victorian perspective, we had a Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act action statement that was 30 years old. So within 4 or 5 months, the recovery team had set a broad vision and key goals and associated actions for the species recovery. And by the end of November 2023, we'd completed a comprehensive conservation action plan. And Adrian, I believe the action plan's actually on your website, and I don't know how it got there, but I'm assuming I might have been sending it to Marissa Parrott one day. And as you know, often your name pops into the send box on my email. So if that's how it got there, so be it.
Do you want me to take it down, Garry?
No. So look, I won't go into much detail in here, but you can see from the vision, we'd identified we need multiple robust genetic populations, that we need those sites protected and managed appropriately, that we needed the ex situ program, and in that vision that we were working towards downlisting the species from critically endangered to endangered. Sitting under that, we had goals, which effectively the first one is around securing and protecting the one rediscovery site, and also undertaking monitoring and research to understand the ecology and biology of the species. The next one was around establishing that ex situ program. The third goal was about identifying and protecting additional habitat and mitigating further declines by working with regulatory bodies to do that. The fourth one was around reintroduction, so establishing multiple self-sustaining populations. And the fifth goal was around effective communication around the conservation activities and recovery of the VGED and grasslands. So sitting under those goals were 20-year conservation objectives, so medium-term conservation objectives. So the first one really does speak to establishing those additional populations. So we considered that 10 to 15 populations with greater than 100 hectares of habitat per site and populations of 250 or more at each site was required. That overall we were aiming for an overall population of 3,000 individuals, so 2,500 in the wild and 500 ex situ. That all potential habitat is surveyed and any new populations are secured against decline and extinction. That the species' genetic health is understood and maintained. That the condition and extent of occupied habitats across all sites was maintained and improved. The populations and habitat were protected from incompatible land uses and catastrophic loss, and that we acquired the knowledge around the biology and ecology and management to actually increase and support recovery. So what's happening on ground and how are we doing it? And how does that relate to our conservation action plan? So right at the moment, we're undertaking a fair bit of work on the rediscovery site to better understand the VGEDs across the site, as well as the overall population status. We're surveying or have surveyed the entire site and collected additional founders and have effectively captured the full genetic diversity of the population. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And we're undertaking work to understand individual movements, growth rates, when key life history events occur, such as mating, egg laying, etc., as well as the activity of individuals under different conditions, including to help understand when it's best to survey for the lizard. So when surveying and monitoring for the dragon, because its cryptic nature, several different survey methods are required. This ranges from articulating endoscopes to grids of roof tiles and pitfall traps. Every method is needed to ensure we can detect the dragon. And because of the dragon's reliance on burrows of wolf spiders for shelter and egg-laying sites, we've also established networks of artificial spider burrows made from PVC piping across the rediscovery site. So this slide is showing Pete down on his hands and knees using an endoscope. And the other images are what we often find down at the end of that camera. So obviously, ample numbers of wolf spiders. Sometimes we'll get frogs down there, but we also get dragons down there. The endoscopes are certainly an effective method. We've got some people who have extraordinary hit rate, I suppose, with using that method, although it does appear that season and in particular biomass cover may influence the effectiveness of endoscoping. And that's probably because, when you've got more biomass, your ability to actually find the holes is reduced. As I said, the artificial spider burrows is really the most common method used across the 3 grassland earless dragon species. We use a mixture of 5x10 grids and also transects. We do put little roofs on them as well to protect the dragons when they're using them from both the extreme temperatures and also from potential predation. And this method certainly appears to be effective all year round, but we're also finding that animals are certainly using them when there's less cover, and interestingly, animals will also use them over winter. Tiles or cover boards, as I said before, is how the species was rediscovered. They are an effective technique for the dragon that use it for cover and or thermoregulation. So we're using the original grids that are still there, 5x10 grids. However, there is some risk in using this method. You can get instances where stock may step on the tiles when there's a lizard under it. And also we've potentially had instances where there has been unauthorized checking where, tiles have been put back and, there's a risk there that dragons may be under the tile as well. So there is a little bit of risk around using that method. The other method we use is pitfall lines. So traditional 100 meters, 40 pitfalls, roofs and drift fences. We've found that this method is less effective, and the other issue with it is it's an active trap, so you can only have it open when you're there, but it's got some dual benefits because we can also use it for our invertebrate sampling, which I'll touch on in a minute. And one other method we're using is eDNA. So it's a method we're investigating with Museums Victoria, and it's a possible method that we could use to swab spider burrows and then see whether we can detect dragon DNA through that method. Look, as the first discoveries were being made, probably the most innovative survey method began to be deployed in the form of our detection dogs. So their ability to safely locate dragons via smell is not only helping us with surveys at the rediscovery site, but they're also hopefully will help us undertake more efficient surveys at other sites of appropriate habitat. The first phase of this work was a bit of a proof of concept funded by the National Environmental Scientific Program's Resilient Landscape Hub. That was about effectively training the dogs to see if it could detect the dragon and then undertake surveys across habitat. Look, through that work, that trial was a success, that the dogs were able to be trained to detect the dragon. We also did some work around scats. That wasn't as successful, mainly because of how rapidly the scats degrade in the environment. But because of that, NEST then funded a second phase, which we're in at the moment, which has allowed us to expand it to the other 3 imperilled grassland earless dragons, as well as to continued work on VGEDs. And look, one of the really interesting and successful elements to that already is that the dogs that have been trained on VGEDs can also generalise and pick up the Canberra Monaro dragons. Right at the moment, we've trained 3 dogs and we're in the process of training another 3 detection dogs. In addition to the monitoring of VGEDs, we're also undertaking other types of monitoring, both on the site and at other locations, undertaking habitat monitoring 4 to 5 times per year to understand how the structure of the vegetation changes through time under different grazing regimes and in different areas of the property. So we're looking at the micro and macro level through quadrats and also drone monitoring. We're monitoring to respond to changes in key weeds as required, and we're also trying to understand microclimate and soil moisture conditions, including within the burrows. As I said before, we're undertaking invertebrate monitoring. This is to understand seasonal variations in invertebrates as a food resource, and also understanding the availability and seasonal variations in burrows. And this is being done through monthly spider burrow surveys across 10 quadrats, as well as quarterly invertebrate monitoring using the pitfalls I mentioned before and sweep netting. We're also looking at diet studies, so comparisons of available versus eaten invertebrates. So some people might know John Wayner. So John's been examining all of our scats to understand what invertebrates the lizards are eating. And we've also undertaken some habitat modelling with Matt White and Steve Sinclair from the Arthur Eiley Institute to effectively model other sites with similar characteristics as the rediscovery site. So that was certainly done very soon after the rediscovery. We're also spending time at other sites. So the priority has been at sites close to the rediscovery site. So we've been undertaking surveys there, including with the dogs. Access hasn't always been easy, with obviously landholders often concerned about potential implications of finding the dragons. But we're also working with partners such as Melbourne Water to get access to sites, as well as Parks Victoria for sites in the Western Grassland Reserve, and more recently working with the Victorian Planning Authority. I will say one of the key issues with identifying other sites, particularly those that have been identified through historical modelling or have, historical mapping, is that what we're finding at a lot of these sites is that when we're going out, that the vegetation conditions at those sites is extremely poor, with the grasslands degrading significantly. In most instances, probably over the last 10 or 15 years when those sites were last looked at, and in a lot of instances that was done around the Melbourne Strategic Assessment. And over that period of time, it appears that active management has been removed from those sites, and a lot of that has been associated with land banking. Look, lastly, and probably more importantly, we've also been significantly working with the landholders and supporting them to continue management at sites. That includes supporting them around the grazing, supporting them with weed control, and also developing an overall management plan for the continued use of sheep grazing at that site. So we've engaged Paul Foreman and Dan Nugent, that some people might be familiar with, mainly because of their work around the Northern Plains and management of grasslands there through grazing for Plains Wanderer. So 2 years in, what have we learnt? What have we achieved? Well, from a population status perspective, we've probably got a population of between 200, 250 individuals. So all up, since we've been surveying, we've detected over 250 unique individual dragons that have been captured. Many of these individuals have been recaptured. We've brought 51 individuals into the conservation breeding program. As I said before, and I'll touch on it again in a minute, from a genetic perspective, we've probably captured the full diversity of the genetics within that population. So 51 is probably the ideal number of individuals. So I don't think, unless something else happens, we probably won't need to bring any more founders in from the rediscovery site. But if we're fortunate enough to find other populations, additional animals will certainly come in. Been spending plenty of time trying to understand the biology and ecology of the species. So we've got plenty of data that's being looked at the moment to understand, morphometrics, movement of the dragons, life history, growth rates, as well as activities of individuals under different conditions. We're finding that, and you'll see the reason why I raise this in a minute. We're finding that the sex ratio on site seems to be even. We're finding there's probably 2 breeding periods across the year, with young being seen in early summer and then in late summer. We're finding that there's large colour variation within the males, with bright lemon yellow throats, and often large varying amounts of salmon sort of orange bellies. It does appear that these animals, probably, grow quick and die young. So the growth rates imply that they're growing very, very quickly and are probably mating in their first year. And we're finding that the animals are probably active a lot longer than we anticipate. So we're finding that they are active during winter. We're finding that animals are moving up and down the columns of their burrows during the day, so getting up higher when there's a bit of sun on the burrows. And we're also finding that they are moving between burrows during winter as well. From the invert monitoring, we're finding that spider burrow availability varies seasonally. We've found that there's at least 60 unique species of invertebrate, both arachnids and insects, within the diet of the earless dragon. However, ants and beetles do make up the majority of their diet. With regards to the rediscovery site, one of the key learnings is that it's extremely dynamic, and the vegetation is certainly influenced significantly by season, rainfall and grazing. This is a really important point to understand, because at certain times, just based on the vegetation, I've got no doubt some people, and learned people, would go out and conclude that this is a low quality grassland, and probably even conclude that it's not VGED habitat. The site can and has had really large fluctuations in biomass. So, when the rediscovery happened at the end of 3 La Nina years, there's lots of biomass. Summer just gone, the place was really denuded of any vegetation. It was, effectively a dust bowl. So the lizard can certainly persist in those two extremes. The unknown is how long can they persist, if you're going into, long periods of, high rainfall and lots of biomass, or, extensive drought periods. While the fluistics aren't great, it does support the structure for the lizard. The site does have a good amount of surface rock in areas which create shelter, as well as open intertussock space, especially when there's large amounts of biomass. But the rock isn't continuous, and it doesn't appear to influence habitat use in other areas. As I've said before, the VGED is highly dependent on the invertebrate burrows, and specifically wolf spiders, and one of the keys around this site is the characteristics associated with the overall invertebrate fauna. The other key factor is that VGEDs aren't evenly distributed across the site. It's patchy and it varies throughout time. So, we've had some grids out where we've had no individuals at all for the first 12 or 18 months, and then lo and behold, we're starting to detect animals under those grids, or in those artificial burrows. So they do, their use of areas across that site does vary. Getting away from the field. So as I said before, the genetic work has been done on all individuals that we've captured or bred. This is partly to understand the diversity at the rediscovery site and any issues around the level of inbreeding, but also the genotype to help us inform pairwise breeding within captivity. So it's good to say that the population is genetically more diverse than we initially thought. It does indicate that there has been a recent genetic bottleneck, but it's still been able to maintain a high level of diversity. We're also sort of entering areas that I don't even really understand. So cryopreservation, we've got cell lines that have been, grown by Museum Victoria, and those cell cultures are frozen within the Ian Potter Biobank at Melbourne Museum. We've had, one full genome mapping done for the species, and right at the moment we're getting a telomere to telomere genome being done at some university in America. So, there's lots happening from a genetic point of view for the species. As I mentioned earlier, the work from Melbourne Zoo from 2019 has set us up for success with the conservation breeding program. Within the first 2 breeding years, in 2023, we had 13 breeding pairs. In 2024, we had 20. We had 11 successful breeding pairs in each of those years, and we had a total clutches of 15 and 14 born. You might be going, how does 11 and going to 15 and 14? Those additional numbers are through female founders that were brought in and were gravid. However, in 2024, 2 of those clutches were actually from 2 F1 females, so females that were bred in the first breeding season. that have never been with a male and produce clutches parthenogenically. So this is the first case of parthenogenesis recorded in Australian gametes. Unfortunately, those clutches didn't live. However, one egg in each clutch, or one embryo in each clutch, went to full term and unfortunately died and failed to emerge from the egg. Look, it's really great to be able to say over the first 2 breeding seasons, we were really successful in breeding 81 individuals. So that's a survival rate of about 94% survivorship from hatchling to adulthood. The only issue we have had is we've got a significantly skewed sex ratio. So this is possibly due to temperature-dependent sexual determination within the species, noting it doesn't appear to be temperature dependent within the Canberra species. So hence we are doing a fair bit of work around looking at incubating subsets of clutches at different temperatures to see whether we can sort of address that skewness. So right at the moment overall, we've got 130 individuals at Melbourne Zoo. At Melbourne Zoo, we've got 4 separate standalone breeding facilities. The first is on public display, so if anyone did want to go in and see it at Melbourne Zoo, it's at a place called Keeper Kids. This was hastily established following the rediscovery and served as a holding facility for the first founders. We then, during our first winter, through the generous support of Colossal Bioscience, we were able to fit out a second room at Melbourne Zoo, which increased our capacity to 150 individuals. So most of the juveniles that were bred in the first and second breeding season are now in that facility. And then in 2024, we were awarded funding from the Australian government's Saving Native Species Emergency Grant to build 2 purpose-built facilities at Melbourne Zoo for the dragon. So those 2 buildings have just recently been completed and we're undergoing the fit out, and they will be finalised in September, and individuals will be able to move into that facility, with those facilities following that. And with this new facility and some further expansion with outdoor enclosures at Melbourne and possibly Werribee, our conservation breeding program does meet the capacity of 500 in line with our population viability analysis and our conservation action plan. And we're expected, based on our breeding rates, to reach that 500 mark in about 2027. So challenges, look, there are a few, but I suppose the biggest one that really is an issue for the future of the dragon, but also for the future of the family, is the rediscovery site. So we've identified acquisition as the best outcome for the lizard, its future management, and for the family. How we do it, though, is a challenge. We're working with government in ways in which we can try to do that. That has been a really, really slow process, but we're continuing to endeavour to work with the government and also NGOs to try to find ways in which we can look at securing that site for the dragon and accordingly and appropriately remunerate the family. Another challenge is the fact that all of our eggs are in one basket. So we've got one site. So we've got limited capacity to undertake surveys at other locations, and to be completely honest, based on what's happened over the last 30 years and what's happened in other jurisdictions with surveys for, closely related earless dragons, we're not overly optimistic that we will find other populations. As I mentioned earlier, other challenges relate to access to properties, as I went through before. And the other key challenge, in line with our vision and our objectives, and also the productive conservation breeding program, is that we need to identify and prepare several other sites for reintroduction. So this is a long game, so we need to be going out and identifying those sites now, to ground truth them, to surveys, and to ensure that there's not dragons there, to ensure that there's invertebrates there, to identify the threats and to mitigate them, to ensure that appropriate management is happening, to get agreements in place with landowners, etc., etc. it's a long process, and one that we really do need to get our skates on to doing, because the risk is by 2027 we're producing 100 individuals per year to try to establish other sites, and we just don't have any appropriate outlets for those individuals. So, linked to that is lastly, we need resources to allow us to do this work. So as I mentioned earlier, the recovery of this species isn't about having animals at Zoos Victoria, it's about having animals within the wild. And look, this is just the last challenge I will touch on, and this generally talks to the regulatory space, and I suppose the pressure on us around trying to have prescriptions around what you need to do to go out and find more dragon populations, and how you identify habitat for the dragon. So, people just need to understand that we're 2 years in to understanding this species, and that all of this information is coming from one site. So trying to develop prescriptions for any cryptic species is difficult, let alone one from one site when you've got 2 years of information. So to give you an example, striped-legged lizard, there's prescriptions for that. I was involved in developing that. That involved 10 years of collecting data at over 300 sites, thousands of surveys, hundreds of detections at sites. And, this is for a species with a wide range, and certainly with less fussy habitat needs. So, we've really got to be careful where we, try to develop a prescription that, for Delma, and, I don't mean this sort of in a lighthearted way, but, if we get it wrong for Delma, there are hundreds of populations. It's not a massive impact, but if we get it wrong around another population of grassland earless dragon, that can be catastrophic. So, undertaking these surveys, and as I've sort of said tonight, VGEDs, its habitat and its detection is highly nuanced. So it's not really something that we can write a prescription and give it to someone with little to no knowledge and ask them to go out and implement it. So from a recovery team perspective, we offer 3 bits of advice: is that you use a combination of your arthropod burrows, your roof tiles, and your and undertake extensive endoscope inspections. Your effort needs to be proportionate to the area of the majority of the habitat you're surveying, and your survey effort should cover the entire active season, not just a small window. Similarly, with habitat assessments, the one rediscovery site doesn't encompass the breadth of habitats and microhabitats that VGEDs occupied before European invasion. And our expertise and experience from the rediscovery shows that the habitat varies significantly, and at certain times can appear substandard for VGED. So our advice to consultants and regulators is don't spend time, effort and money trying to categorise potential habitat to low, medium and high. Take a binary approach. If it's native grassland, irrelevant of the condition, it's potential VGED habitat. And Adrian, I just want to finish on a great little video that will give people a little bit of insights on the program that the dogs are doing, but also, a little bit more about the dragon and its behaviour, etc. That I can't really articulate in still images or in words. So I'll just put this on and then we can finish.
When Daisy and I found our first dragon, it was absolutely incredible. I still remember just over there, Daisy and I were doing a survey like we had done before so many times. And she alerted to a little hole in the ground, and I quickly got out my endoscope and fed the camera down the hole, and there was this tiny, adorable little dragon face staring back at me, and it was just the most incredible feeling. It was absolutely amazing. we had been surveying and training for 6 to 8 months in the lead up to that. Every time we find a dragon now, it's still that exciting. Definitely a career highlight.
Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Gary. That was absolutely brilliant. It's so much the depth and breadth of the all the techniques and approaches that you're taking is quite surprising. That video just reminded me of when I was lucky enough to visit the rediscovery site. One of the people there was measuring a found dragon, and she said it was twisting in her hands weirdly. And she said, "There's something wrong with this dragon." And she looked in its mouth, and she found a spine sticking into the soft palate of its mouth, and quick as a flash got tweezers and removed it, and the dragon was happy again. And that level of knowledge that just like this dragon is twisting oddly in my hand and then being able to identify it was just extraordinary. But I suppose look, we have a few questions, but not as many as I thought. Everyone's been too busy listening to you to actually put questions in the chat. I'm interested in, like, I suppose, the wolf spider burrow aspect of it and how we go about protecting our grasslands in a way that actually encourages invertebrates. Like at the moment, the Melbourne Strategic Assessment, sorry, I don't mean to mention that in particular.
But you can mention it, I just can't.
But you just won't say anything, is busy, you know, spraying out huge amounts of weeds and so on. And you know, there are lots of concerns that's affecting invertebrate populations across, say, the Western Grassland Reserve, which will, yeah. What do you think? Like, should we be looking at other means of weed removal in grassland to make sure that we preserve our invertebrate populations? Or
yeah, look, and for people who weren't here earlier, I was actually speaking to Adrian about, you know, surveys I did west of Melbourne through the Millennium Drought and the complete dearth of invertebrates even then. Look, it's an ecosystem issue, and you know, we'll talk about crises. You know, there's a biodiversity one, but there's also an invertebrate one. You know, Jesse Sinclair is certainly the best person to speak to that. But in conversations we have had, there certainly has to be some level of impact around the use of pesticides and the impact of that. You know, and the compounding impact on the invertebrate assemblages. You know, in saying that, you know, as I said, you know, it's really unique at this site, and you know, whether that's, you know, also linked to appropriate, you know, biomass management, that, you know, the dragon needs it as much as, or the invertebrates need it as much as the dragon. So I suspect it's probably a combination of things. But certainly the extensive use of pesticides, and I don't necessarily know the impact of herbicides, but pesticides themselves would no doubt have had an impact.
Okay. Simon Jolly has a question about your 100-hectare size for a reintroduction site? And given that your rediscovery site is only, oh, I can't remember how many hectares it is.
It's
but
about 100. Yep.
About 100, that big. Okay. So is that the logic then of that 100 hectare?
Yeah, look, to some degree, a lot of it sort of came from also the experience in the ACT as well. And, we came to that sort of area based on, the ability for, self-sustaining populations to be established there, and also for them to be able to buffer the impacts of climate change and weather and stochastic events, etc. This species can be a boom and bust species, so you risk in having it in smaller areas that you lose everything under sort of one event, where based on where they've persisted in the ACT is that 100 hectares is probably enough to provide a level of buffering. The other key point in that, and it's a point that I've had to sort of mention several times, is that we're saying 100 hectares to establish new populations. It's not saying that any site under 100 hectares is not valuable. And I've really had to push that from a regulatory perspective. I'm not saying that we may not have other populations out there that are on areas smaller than 100 hectares. We're just saying 100 from a conservation point of view, but from a regulatory perspective, a 5 hectare site may be valuable, and you may have, species, or earless dragons persisting in a site that small. It's probably unlikely unless there's, a sort of a broader landscape context to it. But, we've just got to be careful, in giving these messages. So, the reason why we're saying 100 hectares is clear and understood.
Adrian, you're on mute.
How did I get on mute? Thank you, Ewan. Kelly Dalton had a question about the spider burrow density, and have you determined any rates of density at the site, at the rediscovery site, where the dragons do occur versus don't occur at that site? And could that be used as a metric for site suitability?
Yeah, certainly Jesse has done that work in regard to what we've found at the rediscovery site, noting, the really key point in that is that there's variation across seasons. So, the spiders actually do close up their burrows at certain times. And the other factor that influences that is going to be biomass. So, can you actually detect all the burrows that are actually there?
I'm not sure if you're allowed to talk about this, but the soils are slightly unique at the rediscovery site, aren't they?
Yeah, certainly they're red soils. They're not, grey or black cracking soils. So that is a unique factor around that site. There are other locations, historical locations, where it appears that they have occurred, on what would generally class as, the black cracking clays of the, western districts or, west areas of Melbourne. We're reluctant to say, it's that soil that, is important for the dragon. Because, as I said, there's other sites, including Coot Island and, the Maribyrnong River, which, as far as, my understanding is, don't have those sort of soils, but we've got historical records there. So, but yes, it is a really unique aspect of the site.
Ewan was just asking, do spiders and dragons share the holes? Or
I think there's certainly some instances where they do. There are certainly other instances where the spider might win out and kick the dragon out. And actually, we've had some remote sensing cameras out, and we've got footage of a young animal. I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, that's out and at 10 degrees, and it shouldn't be out that hour of the night. So our assumption is it probably got kicked out by a spider. These things, and I sort of really didn't touch on it, but these animals, and you saw in the video with Dion, these things are eaten by everything. There's photos from the ACT of animals that we had released up there from our breeding program, and there's photos of praying mantises eating dragons. So, the spiders will certainly have a go at them. The larger lizards on the site, the Tenotus, will certainly have a go at them. The birds, we think, even have a go at them. One of the landholders has certainly, observed, magpies in particular, sort of sniffing around the spider burrows, etc. So they're very, very vulnerable.
Okay. So how similar, so this is a question Olivia Nazario asked that I'm expanding on. She asked, how do other earless dragon species do they have symbiotic relationships with wolf spiders and the other three earless dragon species? But more broadly, can you also, how similar are these four species to each other?
Yeah, so they certainly do. So the Canberra species generally it uses a broader suite of invertebrates, and I think it's the Canberra raspy cricket is one of the key burrows that species uses. Similarly, the Monaro species does, but they also use soil cracks and holes under rocks, etc. The main area in which that occurs is quite rocky, so it uses the rocks as well as natural cracks and other holes. So yeah, as a collective, this four species, and I really only talked to three of them because the fourth one is the Bathurst dragon, and that hasn't been seen for a number of decades. So yeah, they do have a really similar sort of life history and use of habitats, and they are all associated with invertebrate burrows. But yeah, in this instance, these dragons, are really, really dependent on the wolf spiders themselves. We do find them in other burrows, so of other beetles and other invertebrates, but the majority of the time they're using wolf spider burrows.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about the survey effort. The DQ guidelines say minimum 8 weeks, but you said searching was to ensure people cover the full season.
Yep.
Can you just clarify or elaborate on that?
Yep. So that's just the advice the recovery team are giving. It is at odds with what DQ have put out. And look, we work pretty closely with Tim McGrath from DQ, who produced that. As a regulator can make a decision on, what they'll ask proponents to work to. But, as a recovery team and as, having the understanding around this species and also having a lot of experience surveying for it in Victoria and obviously not finding it, and also experience with Canberra species, we believe if you want to increase your probability of detection, you really do need to expand it over a broader period of time. For instance, I think it also speaks to, I certainly know in the ACT, their peak period of monitoring is from February onwards. But our experience at the site certainly shows that, there doesn't appear to be, a preferred period of time around detection, and that we encourage that it occurs across the entire active period.
John Dill Pratt, you have your hand up.
Hi, Gary.
G'day, John.
I saw an earlier question that hasn't been addressed yet, and that is the nature of the internal surface of the polypop. It might answer that one for that question. Mine was just more related to either within this species or from your knowledge of the other three species. Do they interbreed, do you know, or are they capable of interbreeding?
Look, no. As far as I'm aware, their ranges don't overlap. And I'll be honest with you, it was a question that we sort of entertained early on before we got a full understanding of the genetics of the species. Do we need to crossbreed. Thankfully, that's not a requirement. But yeah, will they? Possibly. John, in saying that, from an evolutionary perspective, I think there's estimates of, separation being, I think for Victorian to Canberra, 1 million years. So it's nothing to sneeze at. So yeah, but there would be a possibility of interbreeding. Getting back to the question around the tubes, so inside we paint them with a paint with sand through it, so it creates sort of a rough texture that the dragons can use to move up and down, and other things can also use it to grip and escape from the tubes as they need to.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you.
On the tubes thing, Gary, I'm just trying to find the question, but can you talk us through the best way to get one of those tubes in the ground? Someone was asking that, and I can't find the question in the chat, but it's
with
there.
a bloody lot of elbow grease, Adrian. Look, luckily I've only had to do it. Well, at this side, I've only had to do it a few times. Peter Robertson, with all his years of expertise, has a few ways in which he does it. So he's got a bit of a pole contraption that we use to effectively just hammer it into the ground, and then just slip the outer and inner into the hole. That seems to work pretty well. I know people have used things like augers in the past. So it really is whatever works for you. But certainly Peter's someone to ask, because of, I suppose, the tens of thousands he's put in the ground over his lifetime.
Indeed. So the dogs seem like the real way forward. Like they're good at detecting burrows. And how come you don't have like 1,000 of them?
Look, it is, and again, it's one of the tools in the toolbox, like eDNA maybe. The problem with the dogs is the distance in which they can smell a dragon. So, it's not meters, it's centimeters. So they've effectively got to run over a burrow or very close to a burrow to be able to smell. Now, whether that varies throughout seasons and whether it, is influenced by things like biomass, etc., we don't quite know yet. But that is, at the moment, the limiting factor for the dogs is that you will only be able to do, a small area of a site per day, rather than, thinking you can just sort of let them go, run over a 30-hectare site within a day, and, you can tick it as no dragons if they don't detect anything. So that's the limiting factor, Adrian. Yeah.
Okay. Doug Osborne asks, one very close to his heart, I know. How do you accurately and securely geotag the locations of each burrow? Like, you obviously don't have sticks sticking out of the ground with flags on them or anything like that. But
so the artificial ones,
or the occupied ones, like just when you're actually surveying for like the spider burrows. So
so the artificial ones obviously have the roofs on them, so they're quite easy to find. The natural ones, so we like very, very early on, we when we were bringing in the first animals, we would excavate the burrows and pull those dragons in. We stopped that pretty early on, partly because we didn't know whether burrows were a limiting factor within the property. But it's really invasive. So, we've stopped doing that, haven't done that for probably nearly 2 years. From that perspective, we don't necessarily need to keep a running sheet on where the burrows are, except for the work that Jessie's doing within her quadrats. And she does it, I think she uses like little orchid tags next to each of the burrows. So that allows her to determine where those burrows are every month that she's coming back and doing it. But more broadly, we're not keeping a running track on where every single artificial burrow is. If we are doing endoscope and we find one, we will flag it. And I think there was a picture in that video of just a bit of a small flag that we do put in the ground. We certainly can do it. but we only do it when we need to.
Right. Okay. Thank you. John, you've got your hand back up again.
Yeah, I'm a nuisance, aren't I? Is it just a detection issue possibly with the burrows? Just that they're easier to find in burrows than in most? I mean, you've mentioned other burrows are used. Are we confident that burrows are actually a critical issue, or is it just that it's easier to detect them in a burrow and that they utilize the burrows, obviously, but is it necessarily a very close relationship, or is it just that they're easier to find there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, John. Outside of our sort of passive techniques of surveying, or our active, like pitfall, the pitfall, we really don't find them anywhere else on the property. So the dogs aren't necessarily finding them in tussocks of grass. Look, we don't do rock rolling because of the potential impact that has to the microclimate and the environment under the rocks. But where they do it, say with the Monaro species, they're generally associated with burrows that go under the rocks. So from experience at the site and experience with the other species, it does appear that those burrows are a really important aspect for shelter. The other factor that we really did witness over this last summer, because of how dry it was and the loss of all vegetation effectively off the site, was that that was the only shelter that the dragons had throughout that period.
Thanks, Garry. Thank
you. Okay. Perhaps we'll just ask one or two more questions since we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Dean Ingwisson's got a question. Can you please elaborate on what you said about habitat assessment? I not think of low, medium, high, but focus more on presence, absence of grassland and weeds. Your thoughts on weeds. You mentioned too, like that weeds that affect the structure of the grassland, I think, and also questions about biomass.
Yeah. So look, what we were finding early on was consultants were effectively, like they would do with any sort of grassland survey, is to come back and say, well, this is medium condition, high, low, and really looking at it from a philistics perspective rather than from a dragon's perspective. Our advice to the consultants and the regulators have been, they're looking at it all wrong. Our experience at this site is that the site can vary significandly. It's, as I said, at the start, it's not a great grassland. It's not the sort of places where John will go out and spend his weekends at Wandoo and looking at those sites down there. It's pretty limited. But also at certain times of the year, and we've seen it when we had some summer rainfall. I think it might have been in 2023 or 2024. Exploded with annual weeds. Also, during the summer period just gone, as I said, it was didn't have a lot of native vegetation, but in certain areas there was lots of serrated tussock. So it does vary, and at these times, I've got no doubt. And again, I worked in regulations for 20 years and had to look at thousands of consultant reports. They'd be going out and saying, oh, yeah, this is low quality and this is high quality, and using that to then make judgments around whether we need to go and survey or not. We're saying, because of what we're experiencing at this site, you can't do that with any level of confidence. You need to go out and take a binary approach and go, that's cultivated, that's a car park, that's Phalaris from wall to wall, and say, that's not grassland earless dragon habitat. And you go, has that got grassland in it? Is it in real poor condition? Yes, but it's still, potentially earless dragon habitat. And similarly, if it's good condition or it's medium, etc. It's just, if we're going to try to nuance it and quantify it and categorize it, again, I think we're setting ourselves up to fail.
Well, makes good sense. I gather the rediscovery site has a quite a good diversity of C3 grasses though on it.
Correct.
Yeah, which is a surprise as well. It's full of surprises. Okay.
It certainly is, and I'm saying it's to the untrained eye, and even the trained eye, it doesn't look like a rich, diverse grassland. But Paul Foreman's been out there a few times over the last few months, and he's starting to tick other things off as well. So yeah, as I said, it is full of surprises.
Okay, well, that's the mention of Paul Foreman is probably a timely thing, because Paul is going to be giving us our next Grassy talk next month on the Murray Valley grassland. So we'll be looking forward to that, and we can ask him some curly questions about dragons at the same time. Does anyone else have some crashing questions they really need to ask Garry before we perhaps take a break? All good, all sold, fantastic. All right, well, thank you, Garry. It has been absolutely brilliant having you on, and to hear you elaborate on all of that detail and so on. And we really look forward to your work, and hope that all the things that you can't talk about come to pass in the best possible way.